Thanks for joining us today for Housing Matters. Housing Matters is a podcast dedicated to discussing the importance of development in our state, and it aims to educate and inform the public about the significance of housing initiatives, the intricacies of development, and how individuals can secure their dream homes. I'm thrilled to have with us today George Casey. George is the president and chief executive officer of Stockbridge Associates based in Freeport, where he's known for his approachable leadership and effective communication. George, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, George, I want to share with the audience right out of the gate how I first came to meet you. And it involves actually a past participant on this podcast, Sarah Sturdivant. Mm-hmm. Sarah and I met at a pretty cool event of a 3D printed home up at Orono. And I shared with her this idea that I had around trying to incorporate more offsite construction. And Sarah said, there is a person you need to meet. And if you recall, we went to lunch down in Freeport, or Yarmouth, I think it was. And you shared with me some things. And one of the things that I share with people quite frequently that I want to make sure people hear is this idea of how do you buy a house? But you started it with a really interesting question, which was, Matt, have you bought a car recently? I don't know if you remember asking me this. Yeah. And you said, have you bought a car? And I was like, yeah, George, I have. And you said, well, did you call up and order all the parts and have them delivered to your dooryard and then call your buddy and start putting it together? And I said, no, I went to a dealership and I ordered it. And you said, right. But unfortunately, that's the way that we build most housing in the United States. Yeah. And you have quite a storied career, having been, I believe, the first CEO of Toll Brothers.
No, I was first project manager.
Project manager,
yeah.
Yes.
Bob Toll, believe it or not, was the
right, straight
CEO
through.
From 1967 to like 2012.
And you've built communities with thousands and thousands of homes in them, right?
Yeah, one in Florida for 16,500 homes.
Wow. So I'm hoping that you can share a little bit about what led you to ask me that question, and what you're hoping to do to try to address it.
Interesting. So I give attribution where it's due. That analogy I learned from a fellow named Jerry McCaughey.
Oh, really?
Who's an Irish guy,
okay.
Who set up a company in Ireland about 20 years ago that started doing essentially factory-built housing. And that was his thing. He said, this is crazy. That delivering the parts to your front yard and then saying, let's go down to Home Depot and find somebody to go put them together for us is not exactly the way you'd efficiently build something. And it was driven by actually us talking about a study done by McKinsey in 2017 that looked at productivity by various industry sectors from the end of World War II until that point. And actually the data point ended in 2016 at that point. And you saw that agriculture had like a 5x improvement in productivity. Manufacturing had like a 7x improvement in productivity in that period, though, as I said, end of World War II to 2016. Interestingly, construction had zero.
Really?
Zero. And the question was why? Why had all these other sectors, from auto manufacturing to finance to every other sector, had these huge improvements in productivity, yet construction had not? And so that got into the discussion as to why hadn't it happened in construction? But Jerry, when he used that analogy, he said, you know what? Would we build airplanes that way? Would Boeing, say to deliver stuff into a Portland jetport and say, okay, guys, let's put it together? No.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that. I think Boeing just said that they announced their new plane, the 797, which is to replace the 37 and 47. And it won't even be coming out until 2030s, because they're planning a whole process so that they can then produce it.
And that was Jerry's point, that to do things productively, you have to do a lot of planning up front in order to execute well. And if you look at the construction industry, the amount of time spent planning is minimal compared to the time that you're actually trying to create or build the thing. And the result is that you have so many errors and redos and miscommunications that are easily taken out in other businesses by the amount of time spent designing, engineering, training, a bunch of things up front, so that when you actually create it, it is done highly efficiently.
Interesting. Well, you have quite a storied career. I want to back things up a little bit now that the listeners know kind of how it was that our paths crossed, and kind of dig into a little bit of your background in the military. You have had quite a storied career, but a lot of that started earlier as a lieutenant, correct, in the Navy?
Yeah, in the Navy Civil Engineer Corps, which most people know as the CBs.
Okay.
The construction battalions.
Okay. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Troy, New York, the oldest engineering school in the country, celebrating its 200th anniversary this month.
Really?
Yeah, it was started in 1824.
Wow.
Long before MIT or anything else.
As an engineering school?
As an engineering school. In fact, one of the first graduates was Stephen Roebling, who many people might know as the creator and the engineer for the Brooklyn Bridge.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
He did a bunch of stuff. But anyway, so I was an engineer. I had Navy scholarship, so I was Navy ROTC. Came out, went into the Navy Civil Engineer Corps, and after 18 months in Guam is what's called a public works officer. I did 2 tours in Vietnam, leading groups of people building riverboat bases in the Mekong Delta.
Oh, wow.
On the Cambodian border. And so 50 guys out in the middle of nowhere building things. And the first thing you learn is that in the middle of nowhere, there was no Home Depot. And so what you never wanted to have happen is to build something and then have it blown up.
Yeah.
And so
That'd be a bummer, huh?
that would
It's
not
like
make
building a sandcastle too close to the waves.
Yeah, exactly right. So it was learning how to get things done creatively, but also the thing of how do you make sure you don't get blown up.
Yeah.
So literally, one of the things we learned to do at night, we could see way out in the paddies beyond us. We could see the Viet Cong going back and forth. Said, okay, let's try putting a case of beer out there.
Huh.
And so we did. We put a case of beer out. It'd be gone in the morning, but we never got rocketed, never got mortared, so on and so forth. And so...
Did that work on the job sites in the U.S. too?
I think so. Usually the beer goes out in the morning.
Yeah. Interesting.
No, but that whole experience in terms of experience was learning to be not only creative building things, which you had to be, but also the power of really treating the CBs I had working under me as full equals. Yes, I had rank and so on and so forth, but I really listened to them in terms of ideas of how to do stuff. And I didn't realize that was relatively atypical. But that whole thing of, okay, team, how do we do this? How do we do it better? You know, what's a better way of doing things? Was kind of formative in my career in thinking about how you get organizations to do things.
Yeah, because typically in the military, things are more like a dictator type of an approach, right?
Yeah.
I said so because I outrank you.
Yeah, and that's right. And at that time, that was more prevalent. But the way I was wired was just a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And this whole skill of, okay, how do we tap in, get perspective? Then I had the responsibility for making a decision.
Yeah.
But I also had the responsibility of both listening to people who, frankly, I had chief petty officers who were 20 years older than I was.
Huh.
And you don't discount their experience.
Sure.
And And so learning to listen, in the end, knowing I had to make a decision on how we did things, but really giving full credit and full honor to the experiences they had to help form what we were going to do.
Were they the ones that came up with the beer idea, or you?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Actually, it was Chief Myers. He was a plumber chief.
No kidding.
And the guy was probably 5'2", 250 pounds.
Yeah.
And the one thing we could get.
5'2", 250 pounds?
Yeah.
In the military?
Yeah.
How'd that slide?
Well, the one thing we could get beer very easily. The water you couldn't drink. But we got delivered by helicopter pallets of beer and pallets of Pepsi.
So you could make a health case that it was good to drink beer and Pepsi.
It was, because it's 120 degrees with 90% humidity. That's the only way they could hydrate. And Chief Myers would basically go through a case a day.
That's great.
but he was the real deal.
That's awesome. So how was it that you kind of like transitioned from the military to the private sector?
After 4 years in the Navy, it was kind of like, what do you do next? And I went back to RPI and actually talked with the dean of students, a guy named Joe Harrod, Ira Harrod, but everybody called him Joe, and said, I like running people. I like kind of construction, but I've never had to worry about a budget. How do I learn the business side of doing stuff? And I remember the phrase I used, I don't know anything about money. How do I learn about money?
Interesting.
And he said, well, probably the two best spots to go for that. One would be the Tuck School at Dartmouth College. The other one would be the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And having lived in the boonies for several years, going to Dartmouth felt more like going to the boonies, and the idea of being in a city, that was pretty cool, so I chose Wharton.
Yeah.
So went there, majored in finance, but there was a subsector called real estate finance. Mm-hmm. And that's where I kind of found it, where this intersection of understanding money along with the creation of things that I had also learned my experience in the CBs was I really like creating physical things. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of real estate into this stuff kind of made sense. So that set me off on a path into the world of residential.
Okay. So you went to Wharton, graduated, and we've heard that there's not been a lot of evolution in the housing industry, but it sounds like your career ended up being with some more innovative type approaches around housing, or those that could be. And what did that look like when you got done?
It's interesting because it started off, I'd come out of Wharton. I worked for a real estate investment trust down in Florida for a couple of years. My wife, we got married. I'd known her in college. We got married after I graduated from Wharton. She wanted to come back up here to Maine after 2 years in Florida. And
she was from Maine?
She grew up in East Millinocket.
No kidding.
Skank High School, baby.
Yeah. Wow. Talk about the boonies.
Yeah, so, but it was doing high-rise type stuff that I was financing, and the innovations were in finance at that point that I was seeing. Fast forward, I did a couple of years of consulting, and I really loved the physical stuff of doing. And a friend of mine who I'd known at Wharton worked for the small builder down in Philadelphia called Toll Brothers, which was literally at that point was total of 10 people, including secretaries, carpenters, so on and so forth.
That's interesting because now it's quite a large behemoth.
5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people, and
yeah.
So I went down, and they were looking to change their organizational structure.
Okay.
And it had been a very standard organization. You had a head of construction, a head of sales, a head of finance, somebody who did admin, and so on and so forth. But you went out onto a community that was being built. When I first came into it was one called Yardley Hunt in Yardley, Pennsylvania. It was 449 lots. And when you went there,
It's interesting to me. You still remember exactly how many lots there were.
oh, I can tell you that Dr. Gross lived in lot 403. It was a stone front Oxford Colonial.
Wow.
Okay, and so it's like Prego. It's in there. But the problem was you went out on the job site, and no one owned the job site. The construction guy owned what went on in construction. The salesperson owned what was going on in the sales office. But if you started saying, who owns the performance of this job? Nobody, other than Bob Toll. And Bob kind of understood that. Bright guy. He's a law degree from Penn and a master's of law. Very Socratic, very thoughtful. And he said, I want somebody that would be like I was when I first started. I owned the job. I went out there, I was worried whether the streets were clean, whether the salesperson was doing stuff right, whether the salesperson and the construction guy talking and back and forth. And so it became this development of a project management system, or the starting. So I was the first one, the test case.
Interesting.
Developing the systems of how you run a company that became entrepreneurial. And that structure still lives today.
What do you mean by that, a company that became entrepreneurial?
When you have someone who's responsible for a community, you have to think like an entrepreneur, and you end up hiring people who are essentially generalists to run it. Whereas a functional organization, people come up through construction, they come up through sales and so on, but rarely do those functions come together early. It may come together in the C-suite where you have your head of construction talking to your head of sales. But again, when you went down on the job site, nobody really owned it. And so it was a relatively new concept in home building.
When was this, in the 70s?
This would have been 1979.
Interesting.
And so Bob had run the company functionally since it started in 67. So it had gone 12 years and grown from one community to the time I got there, there were 5.
Was their approach to get the land ready too, or did he find people that had already got the land ready to build on and they built?
So it was so part of being a project manager, I had to go find land. I had to bring it through entitlement.
Really?
I had to, buy out the project.
Wow.
Had to make sure I had a construction team, a sales team, a warranty team, and, make it happen. Then have it happen a couple of times, then hire people that would help me do it and grow an organization that way.
Because my perception is now the majority of the production builders, which I would think of Toll as one of them, are building on land that is getting entitled by other people. Is that true or not true?
Not so much true.
Okay.
It's all brought in-house.
Okay.
In fact, the path to the top in most of those organizations is through land acquisition. The real value creation ends up being in the land, the entitlement of the land, what you choose to put on the land, and so on.
Yeah.
And frankly, the construction side is how little of that value do you not pee away?
Yeah. I think you told me one time it's like having a silo full of water and then people start poking holes in it, and your goal is to make sure one doesn't get poked in the bottom.
Right. And that's it. And so, but again, you go back to the structure. And over my career, one of the questions was, which is the better structure? If you were to go back to most of the other home builders, they're organized functionally. And the question was, which gives a better economic result?
Interesting.
And because they're two very different organizational structures.
Yeah.
And
what do you see most of in Maine?
Frankly, there aren't many people here who are big enough to have to worry about that organizational structure. When you do see it, it's kind of a leader who was the entrepreneur and somebody running construction. So it was like Toll Brothers in 1977.
Gotcha.
The idea of a project manager entrepreneur is relatively unique. You look at the people that I hired for that position, almost none of them came out of construction. I hired football players out of Princeton. I hired a math major out of Yale. Hired several lawyers. Actually had somebody who was a musician. Who were people that, frankly, worked entrepreneurially and could get people to do things. And so it was this, a generalist manager was the phraseology I used. But what it does, the advantage is it creates an organization that grows and scales really well. The problem is that there isn't a lot of standardization. How I chose to put in specifications in a house, was different than another project manager someplace else. They may like Whirlpool, I like GE.
Even within the same company?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so...
And the top was okay with that?
For a while. And then it became, okay, how do you begin to standardize these things? That if we're buying 2,000 houses worth of appliances every year, why we got GE, we got Whirlpool, somebody likes some other weird brand over it, likes buying from Sears. You know, shouldn't we be able to take our buying power and go and say, GE, what would you give me, or what can I get from you for doing all of this?
Yeah.
And so you started creating what's called a matrix organization. That sitting across it was this stuff of, okay, how do we standardize some of the specifications that we have in a house?
Yeah.
How do we have standardized sales systems? How do we standardize the way we train our superintendents so that what we're doing is building the same? And so you start getting this thing of a matrix organization where you have the entrepreneurial, and across it are laying standardized systems, which is the way it works right now.
Which kind of leads into kind of like the evolution of housing creation and how there hasn't been any increase in productivity. It would seem to me, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that offsite construction holds the promise to deliver on that scalability of buying goods less expensive and so forth. Yet, based on what I'm learning, that scaling seems at odds with the preferences of Americans who value individuality and also has a bunch of land use requirements, one thing here, one thing there, so it doesn't lend itself to this widget creation.
In some ways it does, in a lot of ways it doesn't. In order to do factory-built housing or industrialized construction, the buzzword, what do you have to have? You need to have a standardized set of processes going down the line to build things. You typically want to have a simplified product line of things that you build. In the factory-built situation, the failures have been almost all trying to take stuff that is doing customized and doing it at scale. So you come in with a house you want, we try to send it down the line. But to do that, we have to do a ton of engineering, program the stuff for the saws, so on and so forth. And doing it once and then, now we got to do it again. And so it's very unproductive. The ones that have worked well are the ones that have 2 or 3 floor plans, if you would, and run those consistently. So it's like watching a great football team. They have plays they run. They practice them, they run them over and over and over again. So the ballet of how you do things becomes very efficient. I grew up in the days of the old Green Bay Packers.
Okay.
And they ran something called the Green Bay Sweep. You knew they were going to run it, but they ran it all the time and got 4, 5, 6 yards every time. But you watch it was a ballet. Jerry Kramer, the guard, would be pulling out, and he knew that he had a half a count he had to wait. Otherwise, he would trip over Forrest Gregg's legs as he was going by them. Bart Starr knew he had to step back a certain amount, otherwise he got tied up in Jerry Kramer's legs. And so this ballet of doing things well is learned by practice and by doing it over and over and over again. Doing true industrialized housing construction is the same thing. Once you do that, you become very productive going down the line. What's interesting is that, yes, people love infinite choice. The problem is the cost of infinite choice is never talked about. And it's the cost of not doing things efficiently, not productively. See our conversation 10 minutes ago. And so what opens up the possibility is you have to have a willingness to trade some degree or some lack of individuality for productivity and cost improvement, and therefore somewhat better affordability.
Do you think that we're at a point now in this country with a level of pain, if you will, that people just cannot find housing at all, that people might be more willing to accept this more, for lack of a better word, kind of cookie cutter approach to housing creation?
Yeah. I mean, if your choice is no house at all versus, it's not exactly what I want, but it's close enough. If you go back the end of World War II, that was Levitt and Levittown. Tons of people moved into houses that was the 1,215 square foot clubber, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath. You could option the garage. But tons of people bought it because you could buy it for $3,900.
Yeah.
And it was affordable to people working the steel mills, to firemen, to teachers, so on and so forth.
It blows my mind to think about that now. The average price in Maine is over $400,000 for a standard home.
Yeah. But in the process, if you, the Levittown home that was built could not be built in Maine right now because it doesn't have GFIs, it doesn't have fire suppression systems, it doesn't have outlets every 6 feet. So we've managed to regulate, all with good intention, cost into houses. But if sitting in Freeport, there are a couple of houses that would be very close to the Levitt 1,200 square footer.
That are grandfathered in. Yeah.
And somehow people live in them.
Yeah.
And they don't have GFIs, they don't have all this other stuff. So we've managed to, in the case of quote unquote public good, to make things unaffordable.
Yeah. So would you say that the entrepreneurial approach has made the largest impact in terms of housing, the evolution on the housing front, or something else?
The entrepreneurial approach organizationally works and it doesn't work. It works in terms of scaling and growing a company. Running a company more efficiently, you'll see Toll right now doing more of the standardization kind of things.
Just a certain style of floor plan, maybe 3 or 4 different ones.
It's this mix. You want entrepreneurs working inside of relatively defined operating systems. In terms of, it blows my mind that, when I came up, just hammers, nails, still there, still a handsaw cutting things. The amount of tools and the productivity that they have brought has not translated into productivity in terms of cost of building houses, speed of building houses. And the question becomes why?
Yeah, that's the question I have.
Yeah. And so you go back to it. And part of it is that we have lost the ability to create a workforce that trains up and does these things. And in that, you also have reached, in some places, even when you do have the workforce, the limit of what people can do inside of that operating system. When you deliver the stuff to the front yard, if you were to go to Arizona, there are, basically house plans that are built 3 in a community and for a 100-lot community. Those people get relatively good at running the play, if you would, but by building it by hand. The problem is that you're running out of those people. That,
You mean tradespeople?
yeah.
Yeah.
When you think about it, when I was in high school, this is the 1960s, everybody had to take shop. You had to learn, how to use tools, so on and so forth. And it was just part of what you did. But out of that came a bunch of people who, college was not their thing. They'd go in and they'd become carpenters, and sooner or later, run construction companies. They'd become plumbers. In fact, I was at my 60th high school reunion. And the guy never went to college. When he graduated, his dad gave him a septic pumping truck. And
That's one heck of a graduation present.
But you know what? He ended up creating a great septic pumping company.
Yeah.
And off of that, he's built a bunch of apartments, a bunch of shopping centers,
Yeah.
probably one of the wealthiest guys in the class.
Yeah.
But you know what? He did it coming up out of the trades.
Yeah.
In the 70s and 80s, it became essentially that manual labor, trade labor, became devalued, and you only became valued if somehow you had a college degree. Irrespective.
It's interesting to hear you say this because you took a more traditional route of going into post-secondary at some of the most elite institutions that are around.
Yeah. But, I have this phrase that beware apparent truths that are easily financed. So one of the apparent truths was to own your own home is the American dream, right? You probably grew up with that, heard it, that's your
Sure.
gold tone. But also there are some people who just cannot handle the responsibility of owning their own home,
Yeah, that's true.
okay? There's a wide swath of skill sets inside of people.
Yeah.
Yet it became socially unacceptable if you didn't own your own home. And it became easy to finance it. That was Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae back in the 80s and 90s. And what was the result? You ended up with a bunch of folks who couldn't handle a mortgage payment, couldn't do it, and essentially you ended up with one of the core reasons of the Great Recession. But it was easily financed. The financial secret is that the financial people could make a lot of money off of people believing that apparent truth and, essentially pick their pocket.
Interesting.
The second apparent truth, easily financed, is in order to get ahead, you have to have a college degree. Now, it's based on a truth that people who had college degrees tended to have higher income outcomes over a lifetime than those that didn't. Wasn't universally true, but it was more true than not. But when you look at what was the root cause of that, was because you had the discipline, the skill, and the intellectual level to go through a very hard program over a period of 4 years and show you had the grit to be able to run an obstacle course that was a tougher obstacle course. If you were able to do that, that was a fairly good indicator that when you ran into a lifetime of challenges, you could probably succeed in them.
So basically a very expensive litmus test.
Yeah, exactly. And when I started college, it was not unlike going through SEAL training. There were 900 of us in my class at RPI. And the president said, look to the left, look to the right. Only one of the three of you is going to graduate.
And did that become true?
Yeah, my class graduated 400. Of those, 60 were people who had been from previous classes who had washed out and came back in again.
Wow.
And what was the reason? An engineer held people's lives in their hands. You couldn't afford to not be the best of the best.
Right.
Could you imagine having that discussion right now at University of Maine?
No.
Okay. First of all, the development people, what? We're washing out. Do you realize?
We need everyone we can get.
Yeah, exactly right. So, but the point is that if you went back into the high schools, how were principals rewarded was what proportion of your class went to college. Right?
Yeah.
How did you measure school systems when you were out? What proportion went to college?
Yeah.
Not understanding that not all college degrees are created equal.
Uh-huh.
A chemical engineer who's gone through a very rigorous program has a high probability of, doing well. But if you've gone through some kind of program and have a piece of paper, but come up with a skill that isn't valued very well in the marketplace or doesn't pay very well, that's not a good investment. But yet, you borrowed to go do it, and now you're saddled with a bunch of debt that, you can't pay off because you didn't get a job.
Right.
I mean, the data is stunning. Of high school graduates, the proportion of those that go to college is fairly high, actually. It's like 70 or 80%. The proportion of those who actually graduate in 4 years is like 15%.
Interesting. I think back to when I was in college, and I had this kind of unique life experience that really motivated me to finish in 4 years, but otherwise probably would have gone longer. I mean, I was cramming classes in. I just kind of had this zeal to get done for whatever reason in 4 years. And I didn't realize the percentage was that low. That's interesting.
It's pretty stunning.
Yeah.
But it goes back to the thing. In the process, we took out the ability to say there ought to be a second path to a lifestyle, a middle-class lifestyle.
Right, because your wife's from East Millinocket, right? And there's a lot of young men and some women who knew what their manifest destiny was, right?
Sure,
graduate high school, go work in the mill.
Yeah.
So I was talking with a group of leaders about this yesterday, actually, and I'm not this kind of nostalgic individual that thinks we're going to turn things around by all of a sudden mills popping up everywhere. You can't dam rivers anymore, so there's no cheap electricity from it. But talking about offsite construction or this idea of having factories where people go and make houses, I mean, it's not a novel concept, really. It seems to have come and gone. But I think, too, in this country, and I'm curious what you think about this, particularly around young men, who at one point would leave a high school, go work in the factory. They could provide for themselves and their family. We live in a world now in which the rate of post-secondary education graduation rates much higher among women, which I don't think is a bad thing. It's just a fact, okay? And so you have a lot of young men who are U.S. citizens running about the world every day with kind of a lack of purpose and not really sure about what to do. And they also necessarily weren't brought up in a world that said it's okay to work with a hammer and nails or with your hands. I mean, do you think that there's any promise in having housing creation facilities in this country where people graduate high school and go work to build houses?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, one of the things that keeps people engaged and growing personally is, do they have a sense of purpose? And creating shelter, homes, neighborhoods for people, for your neighbors, for your friends, for yourself, is a pretty good purpose. It's a basic purpose.
Yeah.
And were I to put together a company doing that, it would be, what do? We don't build houses. Yeah, we build houses, but what do? We make sure our friends and neighbors have great places to live.
Yeah.
That's what we do. And if you can begin to work around that, the second piece is, if you've got the purpose, are we using modern technology as best as we can to take something that's very complex? I don't know how many thousands of pieces of things go into a house. How can we take that complexity and reduce it? And one of the ways is, you somewhat standardize what you do. If you were going into McDonald's today, what is your expectation?
There's like 10 items on the menu. French fries are going to be hot with good amount of salt, and I could pick a fountain drink.
And what kind of time do you expect that you'd be able
Fast.
to get it? Like a couple of minutes?
Less than 10 minutes for sure.
Okay.
I think my expectations have slid a little bit over the years.
Okay. Flip side. If you go into Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, what's your expectation?
I don't want to be there for less than a couple hours if I can help it.
Right.
And it's
Would you
going to be
expect a
great
wine list?
Yes.
Okay.
And a wonderful steak and
Yeah. Appetizers?
yeah,
Yeah. A good atmosphere?
all of it.
All of it. What if I tried to order lobster thermidor at McDonald's?
They
What do
would
you
look
thi-
at you like crazy.
Yeah.
Unless you go to the one in Freeport where I guess they have lobster rolls now,
Okay,
but
that's
that's an
Freeport.
oddball.
That's Freeport. No, but the point is that McDonald's has chosen to take the very simple thing of how do I eat
Yeah.
and made it simple but fast.
Yeah.
That's what you get, and that's
Yeah.
what you expect. Ruth's Chris is a different thing. Okay, I want to eat, but I want a social side of it. I want ambiance. There's other things.
An experience.
And the menu is broader, but they're organized to do that, and they do it very well.
Mm-hmm.
And my point is that, you know what? There are some people would love a house that's really fancified, willing to wait for it. And yeah, that's great. But it may take 2 years to get them their house. It's bespoke. That's the buzzword.
Right.
Okay. There are other people that, you know what? I want a good place to live. This is what I can afford. And if you can get it to me, I'm happy with that. At some point, I may move up the chain and get another one, but at least let me get started. For that, you can't have complexity. Or you have to reduce the amount of complexity, which means what? Fewer number of floor plans, fewer number of choices on the color of toilet, fewer number of choices on the countertop. You know what? You do that, but at least you get reasonable shelter.
It's interesting you mentioned this, George, because there's a post I saw on social media the other day. This guy, and I wonder to the degree that our problem is a function of our expectations as Americans and what, especially even maybe younger generations, expect right out of the gate. Like, I want to go from 0 to 100 overnight. And this post was, he posted his first house. It was a single wide mobile home, very modest, 14 by 70 trailer, that we've seen all over the place. And he's like, hey, I started with this home 10 years ago, and here's my home now. It's a really nice, beautiful, custom, like 2,800 square foot home. But he's like, I didn't start with the 2,800 square foot home.
No, it is the expectations that you can go from 0 to 100.
Yeah.
And so...
And I think people see it, like with young people creating things like Facebook or whatever, and they just assume they become a billionaire overnight or something.
But what's interesting, up until 1989, 25% of the new housing in the United States came from manufactured homes.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And there was an infrastructure there for doing it. There were places all over the place where you could do mobile home parks and manufactured home parks.
Sure.
That was a big chunk of the starter homes in the U.S.
Yeah.
It bottomed out, and it was typically between 250 and 400,000 units a year were placed.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
In 2007, that number was 60,000.
Wow.
Why? Because zoning had taken away the ability to place manufactured housing.
Yeah.
We didn't want, quote unquote, them in our neighborhood.
Do you think that that's the biggest barrier to housing access?
Yeah.
In the U.S.
Yeah. I think of it as two trees.
Okay.
One tree is the issue of productivity.
Sure.
Can you do things efficiently, cost effectively? That whole productivity thing that went on in other industries, that would help massively.
Yeah.
But the second tree is what we as a society do to ourselves. And that is not in my backyard, tons of regulation of what has to go into a house that's new. And so it is it's kind of a tragedy of the commons that, you know what, we don't want people. It's going to affect traffic, going to affect the schools. I mean, you find all the reasons of why not. And therefore, the zoning doesn't allow it. And, or makes it much more cost effective to contest something than to build something. And so you end up with this world where the impetus is to have nothing happen.
Yeah, because when Sears Homes delivered 70,000 homes to people, still in parts and pieces, but at least from a scaled productivity mindset, there weren't all these plethora of zoning patchworks that prevented those things from being built.
And it's interesting. You know, I've built in, I think, probably 20 states.
How many homes, curious, over your career do you think you've been part of?
Probably 150,000.
Wow. That's remarkable. I do have this big, hairy, audacious goal for my life to be a part of creating 100,000 homes, so we're probably going to have to hang out more.
You better, you better find the fountain of youth, dude.
Well, it won't be me building them, that's for sure, but that's why I'm so curious about this productivity piece.
But the productivity piece, when you go back to, you can produce as long as you have places to put them.
Right.
Unlike producing cars. If I make a car, you don't care whether it goes into your driveway or his driveway or something. There's no locational constraint with a car. Or if I make a washing machine, or if I make a stereo, or if I make an iPhone, it doesn't care where it goes.
Right.
Housing, I can make it, but you know what? You determine where it can go.
It's so true. We have this group we're working with right now, and they want to just go gangbusters with putting up modular homes around central Maine, which is a wonderful thing. And recently I looked at a piece of land, and in the deed restriction from the 1990s, it says the plan for a modular or manufactured home shall be approved by meddler or assigns.
Right.
Because the people that owned that company in the 90s owned also a building material supplier, and they didn't want to be at odds with another company that they owned.
Right. Yeah. By the way, in Pennsylvania, I had a deed restriction that you couldn't slop hogs on the property either.
Oh, really?
That went back to the original William Penn grant.
No kidding.
So, yeah.
So that seems to be one of the largest barriers then.
It is.
Really,
I speak on this a lot nationally. I've been involved with the Urban Land Institute. And I'm convinced that right now this is the elephant in the room. The productivity problem is solvable right now. You have people, there is the ability to make things in a factory. I've watched houses be built quickly. I've watched them built efficiently. That piece is solved. The piece of where it can go is the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, part of solving a problem is understanding the problem.
Sure.
In defining it, what is it?
Yeah.
And I've come to the belief that this is the problem. That essentially, I remember growing up, which was post-World War II, that in a community south of Boston, town of Cohasset, Massachusetts, we were proud to have the fact that somebody wanted to live in our town.
Yeah.
And the fact that, okay, we had to expand the schools, great. Somebody wanted to live in our town. People wanted to be here. We would be a better place. And my teachers lived in town. My dad was a fireman. We obviously lived in town. We had rich people, poor people. You know what? Wanted to be there.
Yeah.
And there has been somehow societally a growth of kind of protecting me. Real estate is looked at as this asset that if I keep everybody out, you know what, my asset's going to become more valuable.
This is interesting.
So therefore, my imperative to the town council, to the planning board, to whatever, how do we keep people out? I'm in right now. If there's still demand. People want to be here. My value is going to go up. This is the best investment I've got. But we've gone from that self-enrichment and away from, you know what, as a community, we're stronger if we are growing together, if my teachers don't have to commute from 2 hours away to work in the schools, if my firemen can't afford to be here, but you know what, I don't care about that. I'm caring about me.
Yeah.
And how you break that idea is probably the root of it. I give Governor Mills a lot of credit
Okay.
for at least beginning to say housing, how we create housing, is important.
Yeah.
But it's a leadership piece. But my business background, the way I've watched how things, you have to change a system in order to get a different result. This is, Einstein's thing. You keep.
So is the only way to do that then so I think back to like I guess it was late 60s or 70s when Romney was a senator, not Mitt Romney, but his father.
Right.
And they had
George Romney.
Yeah, they had Operation, I don't know what it was called, but they created this standard approach, right, for housing creation where they basically said this can go anywhere. Unless then you have local control now that's kind of at odds, and this protectionism that you speak of, which I hate to say it, but it seems to be true. A lot of these entitlement programs that were created that the boomers became the first benefactors of that are now trying to protect it. And now you have like my generation, millennials, and those who are coming after that just, it's a bridge too far.
Yeah. I mean, bottom line, you screwed your kids.
Well, my kid's only a month old, so not me yet. I hope I don't do that.
No, but I look at it, and it is a system we have created piece by piece.
Yeah.
That gives a certain result. You have to find a different system. I keep saying, okay, if I were governor, what would I do? Can I go ahead and get a piece of land using eminent domain and saying, you know what, we're going to put housing at 5 to the acre, which, by the way, in most parts of the country is not dense at all.
No.
And we're going to put it in there in the challenge to the builder that we're doing is, can you bring it in for $150,000 or less without government subsidy?
Sarah and I talked about this on an earlier episode, and it's like, with the infrastructure requirements and Maine Uniform Building and Energy Code, just speaking about Maine, but this is a national problem, it's almost like impossible.
Yeah. But that's why I say
without a lot of density.
Let's take the rule book and throw it out.
Yeah.
Your job is to produce housing that could, we'll call it, be $150,000, and it has to be at least 1,000 square feet. Okay, there it is. Anything else you can play around with, but it has to be market acceptable.
And safe.
Market acceptable.
Yeah.
Okay, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Earlier this week, I was up at Ben Davis's company, Even Keel Group, the Opbox people up in Woolwich.
Sure.
And with him up at the Shelter Institute. So they're taking this material that Ben makes that is essentially a foam board made out of recycled water bottles, that he has a process that he essentially puts what amounts to being a thin fiberglass skin on either side of the foam board that makes it structural. And then those are then put together. First, he was doing boxes, like storage boxes.
What's it called again?
His company is called Even Keel Group.
Even Keel Group.
Yeah, and they have several sub things. One is the business that actually makes these boards that are structural. The second is one that says we take those structural boards And first we made storage boxes. Now they make he sheds, she sheds, mobile podcast studios.
We're going to take the show on the road.
and then with the Shelter Institute,
Yeah.
they're now saying, can we make a house out of it? The interesting thing is the board has an insulative factor. It's lightweight. To put the structure together is like two guys lifting stuff. You don't need a forklift. You don't need any of that stuff.
Yeah.
You can put it on the roof because it's totally waterproof. And okay, in my head, could I take that system, Shelter Institute / OpBox,
Yeah.
and said, you know what? If I put that out there, that I know that is much less expensive because the labor savings, the material is higher than plywood, but what it saves in labor and the fact that you don't have these coordination issues, it's much less expensive. Could I use that? What if I didn't have to follow the electric code that I put in, enough outlets so I could charge my phones? What if for heating I just had the heat pump, the through wall system?
Sure.
And so I ended up with something that, okay, it's better than a tent,
Yeah.
better than living on the ground.
That's kind of like what Boxable's doing a little bit, right?
Yeah. But so that Boxable is doing the same thing using metal.
Yeah.
Their thing was so all of these you're seeing there's a thing of how do you not use wood anymore,
Right.
or use as little wood as possible,
Yeah.
and how do you take steps out? Your wall is your insulation and your structure. I mean, so that thinking about that, say, okay, could we do that? Is it better than no place? Yeah. Is it as nice as something that Knickerbocker makes? No.
Right.
But you know what? It has
Better than being homeless.
But the trick is it market acceptable?
Yeah.
I don't want any government subsidy for it. Free market, figure out how you do this. And if it's market acceptable, let's figure it out. Maybe that is the price of getting people affordable, that we have to trim back the stuff that we've codified.
Yeah.
And
Because it seems like one way that's addressed in other parts of the country that doesn't really appear to exist here are these planned unit communities, which you've been a part of. I mean, I think at one point you told me you had a community that you were responsible to make sure there was a municipal building, a school, a church, like the works.
This is city
This
Western
doesn't
Florida.
happen in Maine at all.
No, but I guarantee you that if I put Weston up here, I'd have people across the Portsmouth Kittery Bridge and up to Presque Isle wanting to live there.
Yeah. Can something like that even happen here?
Physically, yes. Emotionally, probably no. And the question you would ask is, why does stuff like this happen in Texas and Florida and North Carolina and Arizona and California and Nevada and Colorado? Why does it happen there and it doesn't happen here?
You keep asking the questions that I want to ask you before I ask them of you. I love it. So why?
Why? Part of it is the structure of government.
Yeah.
That in those places, it's mostly county-based government.
And with over 400 municipalities here is too much.
Well, you think about it, the advantage is very close to the population.
Yeah.
The disadvantage is very close to the population, doesn't want anybody more to come in. And so the result is nothing happens.
Yeah.
In those places, it's enough removed so that the population is spread out. And frankly, the prevailing governmental belief, whether it's the county level or the state level, they want growth. And they're willing to do things that enable growth.
So we have a mindset problem as well as demographic problem in Maine.
Yeah. And
though this is a kind of a thing, right? Because even in other parts of the country, housing is like not affordable. There's a friend of mine that lives in Florida. It's interesting you mentioned that. And from this area, I posted something that someone was like, why can't we make housing more affordable in Maine? And I posted a podcast of the analysis that we did, of what the numbers don't pencil out. And he's like, well, it's a problem nationally too. So,
but it is working off of different base points.
Yeah, the land's more expensive there.
Florida is worse than what it was 20 years ago.
How's that?
In terms of it's hard to get stuff approved. And you used to be able to get a community like I was doing in Florida approved in 2 to 3 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And with tons of regulatory stuff, but it was how do we get it done, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Here would be probably talking generational.
Yeah.
And there's a plus to that in terms of if you want stasis. There's a disadvantage to it if you want growth.
Yeah.
And these other places have said, we believe that as a strong state, people want to be where things are growing. Mm-hmm. There are things, it's not perfect. The schools are crowded, you got a bunch of other stuff. Incomes are higher. I mean, it's a much different vibe. But the governments in those places are there, and you just read the data. Where are people moving from and where are they moving to? Mm-hmm. You'd like to live in Maine, but you can't afford to be here. A lot of people want to move here and can't find a place. Mm-hmm. So where do they go? They go to North Carolina, they go to Colorado, they go to Texas. And so in the end, they go to where they can both afford to live, mm-hmm. knowing that it's not as good as Maine, but they can afford to live there. Mm-hmm. The price you give up is that all of a sudden, people want to leave the state to go to those places. And so you get a dynamic, but I guess population-wise, that's what we want to have happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like what we say that we want is at odds with the way in which we behave to actually make it a reality.
Yeah. And I keep coming back that in the end, it's a leadership and vision problem.
Yeah.
And where does that leadership and vision? I love the stuff that David Rue and the Rue Institute's doing.
Yeah.
This whole thing. How do we make an entrepreneurial new economy bootstrap work in Maine?
Yeah.
Working on AI, working on all kinds of stuff that's tech.
Yeah.
My fear is that he wins the battle and loses the war.
How's that?
That you're going to have, and I've watched the people coming here, they love it, they're starting to grow companies and so on. Then they go to try to hire somebody. And they can't get anybody to move here with a skill set, not because they don't want to move here. They can't afford or they can't find place to live.
Yeah, it's what comes first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah, and so the result will be we'll have this great system for creating new wealth, if you would, in terms of intellectual property, opportunities, and so on.
Yeah.
But the inability to actually physically live here will be the limiter that will say once these things get to some scale, they're going to go to someplace where they can scale.
It's the zoning piece you talked about. Because if I go and print a 3D house at Orono right now, and then I put it on a truck and drive to Augusta and try to put it somewhere, they're going to be like, whoa, 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 that's like not approved.
Yeah. So as I said, I've having spent a career dealing with communities, housing, and so on and so forth.
It's like we need enterprise zones for housing.
Yeah.
Really, where it says anything, not anything, but almost anything goes here.
Right. And again, my route would be it has to be market acceptable, non-subsidized. So that, but you almost take the rule book otherwise and throw it out the window.
Sure.
And see what comes out of that experimentation.
Yeah.
And because I could provide a house that has no insulation.
Yeah.
It's got an R0 or whatever. And, I'm not going to, in Maine, a house that, I'm going to freeze to death.
Yeah.
You'd have to have some level of, it may not be R40.
Right.
But it might be, R15.
Right.
And the result, would it be as good for heat loss as R40? No. But then again, you know what? I at least have somebody who could move here and have a place to start and move up from there.
Yeah. So I want to wrap up on a kind of a positive note. Oh, this has all been positive, but every week I get an email from you, and it's always very insightful, many different things, most of which have nothing to do with housing or your specifically career background on the housing front. But you strike me as someone that's been a lifelong and continues to be a lifelong learner. And what leads you to kind of create, this email you have? Can you tell people a little bit about its content and also your blog? You have a blog too with Builder Magazine, right?
Yeah, I do that occasionally.
Yeah.
No, the about a decade ago, I had basically CEO'd my last home building company and came to Maine and said, okay, what am I going to do next? And I had spent a lot of time with people primarily in the home building business saying, can you teach me how to be a home building CEO? Which was really, how do you teach me how to be a CEO? And along the way, I bumped into this thing called Vistage, which has been around since 1957, which are groups of 12 to 16 CEOs from different kinds of businesses working at growing, learning together. And so I actually started the first Vistage group here in Maine, then the second, then I've helped a fellow start the third. But it's around the idea of how do you, as an executive, get better. If you can get better, then your company can get better, maybe your family gets better, but together your community gets better. So it's really a leverage kind of thing. In part of doing that was actually, okay, how do you provide these snippets of insight into how to be a better leader, a better manager, better citizen? And so, it's sourced through Inc. magazine, CEO magazine, the Smithsonian. I mean, there's a variety of spots.
Yeah.
With the idea of how do you curate 7, 8, 9 leads, if you would, into these articles. And so you've seen it. It's a couple paragraphs of it.
Yeah.
And then leads you to an article that is not like reading War and Peace. You can typically read them in 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And the idea is that somehow does that help somebody who, even though they're not in one of my groups, maybe they can take that and that little bit of insight helps them get better. I kind of defined my purpose in doing this up here is how do I make Maine businesses better?
I love it. It's interesting because part of following along I'm on the free train for Vistage right now, where I get your emails once a week, but also there's an offer that's been extended to participate in some of these trainings that Vistage puts on, which I've found to be remarkable. I make an effort to go to each one of them each month.
The webinars.
But a few months ago, there was a woman named Robin Sharp, and she had a training, A Sharper You. And we've actually now hired Robin as a company to come in and train our agents and staff on this kind of approach that she has about becoming a sharper you and more a whole person,
But again, what it is, it's exposing you to stuff that may not be here in the state easily.
Totally.
It's maybe from Arizona or whatever. But again, I go back to the purpose. And what can I do to help make this a better place to do business?
Yeah.
And the route I choose to take is how do I take people who have high influence, which are typically business owners, business leaders, whether they're CEOs or CFOs or whatever, and maybe expose them to things that they're not exposed to regularly. And with that, maybe just a little way I've tweaked a change that is positive.
Well, I can share personally, it's impacted my life as a leader and in my leadership. And, at 37, I hopefully have a lot of runway left to impact change in this community and hope to incorporate a lot of those things as we go forward. George, anything you want our listeners to know or any place they might turn to learn more about the work that you do?
Yeah, there's a couple things for like you've done. If you're interested in the blog that or the newsletter, Sunday night newsletter, they can contact you or contact me at george.casey@vistagechair.com.
Okay.
Put you on the email list. Happy to do that with anybody. B, if you know anybody that maybe could benefit by being in these kinds of work environments or group environments, happy to talk to you.
Yeah.
Third, I'm a big networker. And if there's anything that I can do to help any of your listeners, happy to talk with them.
Great.
In terms of just asking questions, insights, whatever. Happy to do that. Again, I go back to the purpose. What am I trying to do? And that's it.
I love it. Because there's a lot of people that come and retire to Maine and just kind of go about their daily business and maybe play 27 rounds of golf a year. Nothing wrong with golf. I love golf, but don't really get out and help in the community. So
No, I don't do golf. My golf is closer to excavation than it is to anything that Tiger Woods plays.
Well, that's good because the community benefits from your active engagement. Thank you, George.
Thanks. Appreciate it.